So welcome everyone to our Scope 3 Standard Program webinar. I'm just going to wait a few moments to let people join. So sit tight, please. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're located. We're really excited today to present an update on our Scope 3 Standard Program, public consultation, and other elements of the program. Yeah, let's get over to the next slide and we can dive right in. So the agenda for today is to give an overview of the Scope 3 Standard Program, and then we'll share key elements of the public consultation documentation that is currently open. We'll talk a little bit about the pilot work that is informing development of the program itself, a quick update on next steps, and then we'll get to a question and answer section. So we have a bunch of great questions that some of our consultative group members have pre-submitted. We think those are common questions and are going to answer those live. And then also have a live Q&A for questions that are submitted during the webinar. So everybody should see the Q&A button in your Zoom window. You can feel free to write any questions in as we're going. Some of those we will attempt to answer in writing if we're able, and others we will answer during the live Q&A at the end. We probably won't be able to get to all of them, but we'll certainly do our best. And a reminder that everyone is muted today, so the raise hand function is not something that will be used. So please submit any questions through the Q&A feature. All right, next slide. So yeah, about us. You can advance ahead. Verra is an organization that is setting standards for climate action and sustainable development. So many of you will be familiar with our flagship Verified Carbon Standard Program. This is the world's leading greenhouse gas crediting program. But we also operate and are developing a number of other innovative programs in the sustainability space. So related to REDD+, for example, and also sustainable development and other community and biodiversity outcomes. We have a plastic waste reduction standard, and our newest program is the Scope 3 standard, which we're all here to learn about today. All right, next slide. So the vision of the Scope 3 standard program is to unlock immediate and large-scale investment in supply chain climate action. And you can see here on the screen some of the team members that you'll be hearing from, actually all of us today. So John, Luca, Shay, and myself, Stefan Yerka. So yeah, we're really pleased and happy to be able to share some details with you today. Next slide. All right, so leading up to this point, we've been conducting a lot of research for the last 18 to 24 months on the current status of Scope 3 emission accounting. We've run a bunch of working groups and early pilots to gather data and information on what some of the key challenges are that corporates are facing in the Scope 3 space, and have identified a number of gaps, really. So, for example, there is a lack of primary data on company emissions reporting, so a lot of use of secondary data from LCA databases, and this data can be very generalized and not very accurate. There's also a lack of standardization in accounting rules and quantification methods, which makes comparison then across companies using different approaches quite challenging. There's also a lack of transparency around assurance rules and procedures. And again, that's another big challenge. So the S3S program will deliver a bunch of innovative and harmonized requirements to address these challenges, starting with auditable and robust program requirements. So that's a lot of what the current documentation that's available for view in the public consultation outlines in detail. There will be standardized quantification methods that leverage primary data that is collected as part of interventions deployed as part of the program. And there will be third-party verification of interventions and greenhouse gas outcomes using the established network of auditors, validation verification bodies, or VVBs. The program, crucially, will be digitally native. So we think this is a really important advance in the space to streamline and make project and intervention submission more efficient through fully digital suite of tools. And lastly, there will be a transparent registry that will enable co-investment in Scope 3 intervention. All right, next slide. So broadly, we're thinking of the Scope 3 standard program as being launched in two phases, what we're initially calling version 1 and version 2. So on this slide here, you see the key elements of version 1. The blue boxes on the left have some of the main elements, starting with, oops, I think we need to get back to slide 7. Thank you. No problem. Yep, starting with interventions that are implemented via activities that generate greenhouse gas outcomes, so emission reductions or removals. Those interventions are quantified using project-based accounting methods that are going to be comparing baseline versus project scenarios to establish what is the greenhouse gas impact of that intervention. And then those outcomes or impacts are attributed to impacted products in a company's supply chain. That then enables the issuance of intervention units to intervention proponents, which are the entities that sort of own and control the intervention itself. So on the right side, there's a flowchart that outlines at a high level the process that version 1 follows, beginning with the design of interventions by intervention proponents that then submit documentation and request registration with Verra. That then leads to the engagement with third-party auditors, VVBs, to validate the documentation that's submitted. Upon approval, it comes back to Verra and can be registered. And then that begins the process of implementation and monitoring of greenhouse gas outcomes and activities and associated elements of the intervention. And at the end of a monitoring period, there is a request for verification approval that then would trigger another engagement with third-party VVBs and a verification, which will lead to the approval of impact units and issuance of impact units to the intervention proponent. So that's version 1 in a nutshell. Let's move to the next slide so we can talk about version 2. So the second main element or component of the program, which would come a little bit later. And this really builds on version 1, so it includes everything in version 1, but in addition, really gets into the establishing the right to report, so a framework to assess a company's right to report. And this is based on whether a product in the company's value chain is equivalent to the impacted product in the intervention. Once the right to report is established, Scope 3 intervention units, which are derived from intervention units in version 1, can be issued to all companies with a verified right to report. We think that this will really enable co-claiming and co-investment through this establishment of right to report, and think this is kind of a key missing piece in this whole space. Importantly, there will be safeguards to prevent overissuance and overclaiming of Scope 3 impact intervention units, excuse me. For example, limiting the number of units that can be issued per tier of the supply chain. So it's important to underscore here that the scope of the program will not extend into integration or verification of company emissions reports. There will be some guidance perhaps associated with that, but no verification, right? This program really stops at identifying the right to report for individual companies. So moving to the flowchart on the right, coming from version 1 into version 2, a company would submit a right to report application that then again is third-party verified and would lead to the issuance upon approval of Scope 3 intervention units to the reporting company. So that is kind of a high-level overview of the Scope 3 standard program. I will now hand it over to my colleague Shay to talk about some of the key elements in the program, in the public consultation. Over to you, Shay.
Thanks, Stefan. Okay, so on the next slide, you'll see a list of the program documents and consultation topics that we have released for public consultation. The difference between the program document and a consultation topic is that documents are going to be core documents that you'll see published on our website when the program goes live. For the VCS program, you would recognize these as the standard, the definitions, the registration and issuance process, and concepts are more conceptual frameworks that will be woven into these core program documents. So for example, the assurance framework will probably live as requirements in the standard, but we're presenting the concept to you for public consultation. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to walk us through a couple of the program documents. The first one is the Scope 3 standard program. So this one sets out the requirements for interventions, intervention proponents, VBBs, and you'll recognize it as very similar to the VCS standard. So with that lens, thinking about our standard versus the VCS standard, since many of you are probably really familiar with the VCS standard, I've highlighted some of the key sections that we've either modified or added in our standard. So first off, our ownership section is a little bit different than the VCS standard. We have intervention ownership and unit ownership in our standard. And in the VCS standard, they just talk about project ownership, which is very similar to intervention ownership in our program. We've added the concept of unit ownership to our standard as well, as a safeguard for Scope 1 entities which own impacted products whose Scope 1 emissions are affected by intervention activities. And unit ownership helps to ensure that there's transparent and clear agreements between the Scope 1 entities and the intervention proponents who will be issued intervention units that represent the GHG outcomes achieved by the intervention. We also have two different start dates in our program, the intervention start date and the activity start date. And the activity start date is going to be very similar to the VCS project start date, but we have a different take on the intervention start date, and that's described in the standard as well as the definitions doc. We also have an issuing period instead of a crediting period in our program. And in our program, the issuing period is going to be 5 years renewable, which obviously in the VCS program, they have a 7 and 20-year crediting period and 7 and 10-year crediting period, as well as between 20 and 100 for AFLU projects. So a little bit different take on that as well. We also have some different KML requirements in our program. So all interventions, regardless of if they have one instance, multiple instances, if they're grouped, non-grouped, AFLU, non-AFLU, all interventions are going to submit a KML file with a polygon delineating their intervention area. And that's going to help us ensure that our registry and program is as transparent as possible. And it's also going to help enable co-claiming in version 2 of our program. We also have 2 new sections on impacted product and attribution, which are obviously not in the VCS standard. And then we do a different take on additionality than the VCS standard. So we don't have full additionality in our program. Instead, we require that all interventions are in regulatory surplus, but we don't require full additionality. And the rationale for that is well described in our methodology adaptation guidance, as well as touched on in the definitions document and the standard. And then lastly, we have leakage being reported separately in our program. So the quantification of leakage will really remain the same as in the VCS program, but leakage will be reported separately. And that means that leakage is not deducted when GHG outcomes are being calculated, as it would be when net ERRs are being calculated in the VCS program. So that's a pretty big difference as well. Next slide, Luca. Okay, so next we have the Scope 3 standard program definitions, and this one's pretty self-explanatory. It basically highlights all the key terms used throughout our program documents and defines them, as well as organizes them in thematic appendices. And we also use some visuals to help kind of explain the relationships between terms, but this program document is going to be very useful as you read through all of our program documents as well as our consultation topics. And I will hand it over to Luca.
Yes, thanks, Shay, and hi, everyone. I'm now going to talk about another document that we released in the public consultation, and this is the program guidance for the adaptation of VCS methodologies. And the objective of this document is to provide guidance for adapting VCS methodology into the Scope 3 standard program and within this framework. So what we have done here is to outline which of the original methodology sections and or concept should be maintained or modified to work within the requirements of the program. And also, as Shay briefly mentioned, we also highlighted the intent and the reasoning behind each recommendation. This program was developed starting from the reasoning behind each of the recommendation with 24 members of the program Scope 3 standard program development working group, which ran through all the 2024, so last year. And then it was also the first test, the pilot of the Scope 3 standard program have tested in their, have provided some feedback. So this is to say that it's something that we have actively looked for feedback and obtain a broad feedback from different stakeholders. Now, there are currently undergoing testing within the pilot process, but I'm also going to talk a little bit more into detail later on. In this table, you can see as a glance the main section VCS of a VCS methodology, and then the decision if it has been maintained or modified to work into the Scope 3 standard program. I won't go through each of one in here, but I would invite you to refer to the document that you can see among the one published for the public consultation. I will just flag a couple of important one, which if you are familiar with the VCS, it's important to note. So the first one, it relates to additionality. As also Shay mentioned, this is something that we are going to modify into the Scope 3 standard program. as only the regulatory surplus is a requirement that has been kept and is going to be kept in all methodologies, while all other additionality requirements have been omitted. Another important one, it relates to leakage. Here, the idea is to keep it as a separate quantification in order to offer flexibility for the company when they integrate into their emission report. So leakage won't be deducted while quantifying any GHG outcomes. And there is a similar modification in the quantification and reduction of removal, as both reduction and removal are required to be kept separately. Again, if you want to deep dive on each of these topics and also understand the reasoning behind it, you can refer to the original document, the adaptation guidance document. For the next one, which is the integration guidance, I'll give the word to John.
Thank you, Luca. Yeah, so this is the final program document that's out for consultation. And this is a guidance document on integration guidance. So really this is providing guidance on how the Scope 3 standard program outputs could be used in company emissions reporting. And we call this integration of the information into a company's emissions report. This is a guidance document because it goes beyond the scope of the program in terms of what the program can assure and verify. But obviously we want the intention of the program is for companies to be able to report this information from value chain interventions in their emissions reporting. So yes, the guidance is intended to aid users on how to use the program and report this information in their emissions report. Because there is high variability in how companies are doing their emissions reporting, the methods they're using, the data they're using, just the approaches for how companies are putting together their emissions reports and inventories, it means that each company has to determine how to use the Scope 3 program outputs according to its own circumstances, i.e. it's really difficult or maybe impossible to develop rules for generic rules for how the output should be used because of this high variability between companies. And so that's the reason why we've developed this as guidance. So the guidance provides information on issuance limits that help to avoid double claiming, how to align boundaries between the information in the units and a company's emissions reporting boundaries, how to interpret baseline scenarios and match those with how a company's emissions report is put together. It describes two different integration methods, substitution and subtraction. Both of these methods are available for use using the Scope 3 program outputs. And it also describes how attribution and allocation are kind of done within the Scope 3 program and the limits of those pieces within the Scope 3 program. It also describes some safeguards to help prevent overclaiming or overissuance, depending on the integration method that's being used. And I will hand back to Shay for the next piece.
Great, thanks, John. Okay, so this is the first public consultation concept that we're going to be talking about today. And this is an overview of the assurance framework. So the assurance framework provides a conceptual proposal for the assurance of interventions. And when I say assurance, I'm really talking about validation and verification, but this proposal is really more focused on verification as the engagement type. So we know when we're thinking about the Scope 3 program versus the VCS program, we have some specific, unique challenges and demands from the market that we need to address with our program. So one of the major ones is that reporting companies need to be able to report out annually out on their emissions, and to be able to track progress towards their goals, their targets, etc. So we need to be able to facilitate annual assurance in our program in order to be successful at this time. And so this assurance framework and concept is really trying to walk that line and find that balance between enabling annual assurance in a feasible way, but also ensuring that our program is still maintaining a high level of integrity. So some of the levers that we've been considering and that we were proposing with this concept is offering some flexibility with the level of assurance, so reasonable versus limited. In the VCS program, if you're familiar with the VCS verification, that would always be done to a reasonable level of assurance. So we would be offering an additional level of assurance called limited level of assurance. And then we're also playing with this concept of verification scope. So again, to reference VCS, a VCS verification would be done, we can think of it to a full scope, or it would be a full scope verification, whereas we're kind of creating this concept of a focused scope verification, which would really be zooming in on just the quantification, and we would also have other safeguards in place that would limit what an intervention proponent can do during a focused scope verification type engagement. So we wouldn't allow them to add new instances. They wouldn't be able to do deviations. It would really be the VVB just hunkering down on the quantification and ensuring that that's accurate. So to walk you through this table, in our program, an issuing period is 5 years. It always begins with a validation, just like in the VCS program, and it always begins with a full scope, reasonable level assurance verification, again, just like the VCS program. However, in years 2 through 5, or any interim years after that full scope, reasonable level verification, that first one in the issuing period, we are proposing allowing intervention proponents to choose kind of different engagement types based on kind of their needs. So let's say an intervention uses a lot of meter data. They can monitor their data really easily. They can kind of roll it all up into a monitoring report. Maybe they would choose to do all of the rest of their verifications to a reasonable level of assurance, and they would do a full scope verification, and it would be basically just like VCS. That's totally fine. But for interventions which maybe are limited by cost, or it takes longer to get that monitored data, they might be interested in doing a limited level assurance verification, or potentially a focus scope verification in those interim years after that first full scope verification. So the proposal gets a lot more into detail about kind of what's the difference between reasonable and limited, what's the difference between full and focus scope, but hopefully that gives you an idea of how we're kind of trying to strike that balance between enabling annual assurance and maintaining high integrity. I'm going to pass it back over to John now.
Thank you, Shay. So the second concept included in the public consultation document is about removals and the non-permanence framework. So this presents a conceptual proposal for how removals will be quantified and how do we manage permanence and non-permanence risk within the program. The intent of this concept is to facilitate and operationalize the Greenhouse Gas Protocol land sector and removals guidance. Obviously, this is still in draft, but we're using kind of the most up-to-date information we have about the land sector and removals guidance. And the proposal includes how we would define removals and reductions with non-permanence in the program, how we would be transparent about non-permanence risk of units issued in the program, proposing to use the non-permanence risk tool developed in the VCS program and applying it within this program just to be transparent about non-permanence risk that might be associated with certain units. How we would monitor for permanence, and how we would deal with particularly timeframes for monitoring for permanence, how we would assign liability for reversals proportionally, both over time and if an intervention was operating in both the VCS and Scope 3 standard programs. How the program would facilitate reporting of reversals by companies that have reported removals or reductions with non-permanence risk. And there's also a concept for the inclusion of a non-permanence buffer. The non-permanence buffer in this program would not be pooled, but would be specific to each intervention. So obviously there's a lot more information in the concept. So if you're interested, I would encourage you to go and have a look. Next slide. And the final concept in the public consultation document is, I think it's titled Streamlined Approach for Measured Parameters. Really, this is a conceptual proposal for how do we align timelines for direct measurements of carbon stocks and timelines for company emissions reporting. So often it's difficult or impossible to measure a statistically significant change in carbon stock over short timeframes, i.e. the annual timeframes that companies are going to be reporting on. And so this is a proposal for how do we address that challenge using non-measured carbon stock values within an interim period between sort of a maximum period between which direct measurements are allowed or required, sorry. And so the units that are issued using these non-measured values would be labeled, so it's transparent that they have been calculated using non-measured carbon stock values. And then at the end of this period, we're proposing a true-up where we use the direct carbon stock measurement, and then there are rules for what happens if the previous issuances in this sort of interim period have been over-issued or under-issued. And so it's a bit of a carrot and a stick approach to hoping to ensure that the issuances in the interim period are as accurate as possible. And I will hand back to Luca to talk about our piloting.
Yes, thanks, John. Yeah, we wanted to take one moment to talk and give you a highlight of the pilot work we are doing to test all the documents and processes and requirements that we have gone through it until now. So we are two work streams that are active. One is the full pilots and the other one is the discovery pilots. The full pilots are actively adapting and working with piloting intervention related to VM42, so the improved agricultural land management, VM43, which is a methodology for CO2 utilization in concrete production, and ACM 0009, which is a fuel switching methodology from fossil fuel to natural gas. While the discovery pilots are working with VM41, the methodology for reduction of methane emission, VM45 and VM47, which they are reforestation and revegetation methodology, and VM45, the methodology for improved forest management. You can see all the participants on the right side. We have 3 Degrees, which is working with Carbicrete and others. Bayer Crop Science, working and partnering with Atoa Carbon and Perennial Climate, Clim GmbH, Patagonia with the new climate as a technical advisor. And then within the discovery pilots, we have American Forest Foundation, Rabobank, and Truterra. What I want to highlight here is what we've done until now. As I've was mentioning before, they have been really critical and instrumental to provide feedback for the initial reasoning behind many of the documents that we have shared with you today. But also they've started testing and working with the practical real-world application of the program. In the last few months, they have provided and drafted the first version of the adapted methodology. And now we are currently testing the methodology, the adapted methodology, and within also the rules and the process of the program. These pilots are going to last until September of this year. And yeah, we just want to say that we're really grateful for their work, as they've provided a lot of insights and are necessary to have, and critical to have real world and real case feedback from the program. I also want to share a couple of next steps, considering what we have shared until now. So the consultation is going to run until April 21st. We have received some requests to extend the consultation. Unfortunately, we're not able to enable it because we are on a tight timeline, and our objective is to release a preliminary version of the program this year. This is the reason why we are going to, we must keep April 21st as the consultation deadline. As soon as we close the deadline, we're going to start working through each feedback that we receive and provide a summary of the public consultation feedback that is going to inform the update and the continuous development of the program. While we do that, as I mentioned, the pilot work is continue to working on real case application of the program, and the objective is to release a preliminary version by the end of this year, so of 2025. We're going now to move to the next section, which is answering some of the consultative group questions that we asked you to provide input before the webinar. And then if you have some time left, we are going to answer some of the questions live based on the time that we have left. I think that for the first question that we have, John is going to take it and answer it.
Great, thanks, Luca. So the first question is a really common question that we get asked with respect to this program and also the VCS program. And it's about whether carbon credits can be used to achieve Scope 3 science-based targets. And I also saw some questions come in during the webinar about whether the intervention units or Scope 3 intervention units issued through the Scope 3 standard program can be used towards science-based targets and net zero science-based targets. The answer to all these questions is quite similar, so I'll try and answer them all together. And it starts with the roles of Verra versus other accounting and target setting organizations. So the Science-Based Targets Initiative sets the rules on what can be used to achieve the targets that are set using the SBTI framework. And SBTI defers its accounting rules and requirements largely to greenhouse gas protocol and the corporate inventory accounting standards that Greenhouse Gas Protocol has developed and is continuing to develop. So both SBTI and Greenhouse Gas Protocol are clear that carbon credits cannot be used or cannot be reported within a Scope 3 or Scope 1 or Scope 2 inventory, and that the carbon credits must be reported separately as beyond value chain mitigation. Although we suspect that some organizations are actually using Verra's VCS or carbon credit program to at least quantify, using some of the same methodologies from the VCS program, or in some cases going through verification. Again, that could be within or external to the VCS program, or even sometimes all the way through to certification and issuance of carbon credits, and using that framework to make Scope 3 claims or make claims within their inventory. And we saw that there was this gap, programmatic gap within the market. And this is why we're developing the Scope 3 standard program, which does not issue carbon credits, but issues intervention units and Scope 3 intervention units that are geared towards being able to be reported in a company emissions report. And so that is the intent of the Scope 3 standard program. The program doesn't fully align with Greenhouse Gas Protocol accounting and accounting standards, but we hope that by developing this program and operationalizing a lot of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol accounting requirements, we can kind of bring the sector along in terms of how do we operationalize a lot of these requirements through a program. But of course, in the end, it all depends on the decisions of SBTi and other target setting organizations and Greenhouse Gas Protocol as to what is accepted in terms of what can be used to achieve targets set through those frameworks. And I would also add that SBTi recently released their Net Zero version 2 draft for public consultation. This includes a proposal for more recognition for the use of carbon credits under that framework. And there are other claims such as the VCMI Scope 3 flexibility claim that also includes more options and more flexibility for the use for making claims using carbon credits as well. And I will pass over to, I'm not sure who I'm passing actually to.
It's me.
Okay.
Okay, great. Thanks, John. Okay, so the next question we got from the consultative group was, can IUs be traded or sold? The quick answer to that is no. And how does the Scope 3 standard program enable co-claiming? So I'm gonna have us proceed to the next slide, and we'll use this visual to try to answer both of those questions. But yeah, so you can see that Verra issues, the blue box issues 100 in this case, IUs to the intervention proponent. These are never traded and sold. They just live in the intervention proponent's account on the registry. But in a way, you could also say that they don't just die there, right? So the intervention proponents birth the Scope 3 intervention units, which are then issued to the reporting companies who are part of this shared value chain. So let's take tier 1, for example. We have a grain processor, and they source some grain that's an impacted product in this intervention. And so they're issued 70 Scope 3 intervention units because they have an improved right to report and they're in tier 1. So the IUs are never transferred, but because they birth kind of these duplicative, or not really duplicative, but just like a layer down of intervention units, they share all that data that comes packaged in the intervention unit. So the intervention unit, it's not transferred, it's not sold to the reporting company, but it does birth these Scope 3 intervention units that are issued to reporting companies, and those reporting companies can make claims on the Scope 3 intervention units that they are issued, or the GHG reductions represented by the Scope 3 intervention units that are issued to them. And then I think the second question was, how does the Scope 3 program enable co-claiming? So as you can see in this figure, multiple organizations, in our case, we're calling them reporting companies, in different tiers of a shared value chain, are going to be able to claim the same emission reductions represented by those 100 IUs achieved by the intervention. And this is allowed because of the shared nature of Scope 3 emissions. So version 2 of our program, with the issuance of Scope 3 intervention units, does enable co-claiming through that mechanism that I just described. And we could spend a lot of time on this figure, but I think I'm just going to keep it there for now and pass it on, I think, to Stefan.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Shay. And we've also been getting great questions in the Q&A. We've answered a number of those in writing, and we'll try to buzz through these consultative group questions and answer some of those live questions at the end here. So This question is, will Scope 3 interventions and/or credits be transferable with the VCS program or other programs? And we actually have a couple of related questions already asked in the chat. So someone asked, we have a registered VCS group project that's ideal for Scope 3 insetting. Can we merge or transition this group across to the S3S program? The answer is we are definitely designing the S3S program to enable some interoperability between the VCS program specifically. So, for example, a lot of the rules and requirements are very similar and derived from the VCS program. The quantification methodologies, as you saw from Luca, are being adapted from VCS methodologies. So there is already a lot of comparability and interoperability, but there are some key differences, for example, related to additionality and project boundaries that do need to be worked out. And so really the specific rules and details are still going to be established in terms of how a program could or an intervention or project could switch between the two. Crucially, though, you could never have an intervention or a project that is sort of live or active in both programs at the same time to avoid any double counting or double issuance risks. So I think I'll leave it at that, and we can move to the next question.
Yes, thanks, Stefan. And the next one relates on the relationship between the greenhouse gas protocol and our program, so Verra, the Scope 3 standard program, and if companies are required to choose one over the other. So just to offer some clarification on this, the greenhouse gas protocol and the Verra Scope 3 standard program serve different but complementary purposes. So the greenhouse gas protocol still providing the overarching framework for accounting, corporate emission, also considering the Scope 3, including the Scope 3. So this remains the foundation for how companies shall structure their emission reporting. While the Scope 3 standard program objective is to offer standardized methodologies, the verification, certification, and so a series of tools and a program that is specific for value chain intervention that reduce and remove Scope 3 emission. There is a little bit more on this in the integration guidance, as John was mentioning. And so while the greenhouse gas protocol is the overall accounting framework, we have provided some suggestion on how the Scope 3 standard program can also integrate in the emissions report of the reporting companies within that framework. I will leave at this and move to the next one.
Thank you, Luca. So this next question is about the use of the Scope 3 program, particularly for a type of intervention where there is a product switching. So that would mean where a high emissions product is being changed or switched for a low emissions product. And so the answer to this question is that it depends on what the activity is and if there's a methodology for it. And really, how easy it is to show this change in a company's emissions report, whether sort of using the Scope 3 standard program or not. So often a product switch will be detected by just changing the emission factor that's used in the emissions report. So, for example, if there was a change from using steel to using wood in the construction of a building or something, then simply changing that emission factor might do a good job of just representing that change. And so the use of the utility of the Scope 3 standard program in that particular case might be limited. In other cases, changing the emission factor might not actually do a good job of quantifying that change, or it might not even be possible, particularly if it's embedded deeper within an emission factor. So, for example, switching the fuel that's used in a boiler that's used to then produce a product, an impacted product within a factory, that might not be quite so clear cut in terms of being able to change out one emission factor for another. And so this might be a case of a product switch that might be more useful to use the Scope 3 standard program to quantify that change or that activity. The Scope 3 standard program also adds on verification and certification. And so that might also be another reason for using the Scope 3 standard program for a product switching activity. Yeah, and then just to add that obviously sort of following the VCS program framework as well, in order to quantify anything through the Scope 3 standard program, there will need to be a methodology that's developed for it. So that will be another need if you were going to use the Scope 3 standard for this type of intervention. I will pass over to Shay, I believe.
Great, thanks, John. Okay, so this consultative group member was curious why we require baseline scenario and regulatory surplus to be reassessed at every issuing period, which in our program would mean every 5 years. And so we want to make sure that the baseline scenario and also the baseline emissions mimic as closely as possible the life cycle emissions factor that are used by companies. So reassessment helps to ensure that quantification is being done accurately and to mitigate risk of overissuance and overclaiming, which would happen if activities are already being captured in that original emissions factor. So that's why we have this periodic check every 5 years where baseline and regulatory surplus are being reassessed. Over to you, Stefan.
Okay, thanks, Shay. Here's a question again about digitalization. Will the Scope 3 standard program be digitalized and enable digital MRV? So the answer is yes. We are already working with our tech team to begin to digitalize key elements of the program. So many of you know that the VCS program already has a digital project submission hub. So the Scope 3 standard program will build on that, and the idea is at program launch to have a fully digitally enabled process and tool and platform to enable digital submission. And digital MRV will be part of that. That's a little bit still in the testing phase, depending on the methodology and project activity. But we very much want to also enable digital MRV. And the VCS pilot work that's digging into that will inform this work as well. All right. Next question, and I think then soon we'll get to the live Q&A with a few remaining minutes.
Yes, thanks, Stefan. This is the last question we received among the fixed one. So this is related to exactly what should be included in intervention boundary, and if it extends to include the sales area of the impacted product. So this needs a clarification as the intervention boundary, and you can also refer this in the definition document. Include 3 key components. The first one are the temporal boundaries. The second one are the geographic boundaries, and the third one are the relevant emission sources, sinks, and reservoir. So regarding the geographical boundary, the focus here is on the physical location where the intervention activity takes place, and so where they generate the GHG outcomes. This could be anything from production facilities, agricultural land, or any other area where the emissions are being reduced. The intervention boundary, to answer the second point, does not extend to the sales area of the impacted product. The definition of the impacted product is goods or services that are produced within these intervention boundaries and are affected by the intervention activities, but it's limited to where the actual emission reduction takes place. Just give you a quick example. In case of an intervention that reduce fertilizer emission in a farm, the boundary would include the farm fields, so where the actually happens this reduction, but not the area where the resulting crops are then sold. Again, I'll invite you to go through the definition, as they can provide additional clarity on each of these important word and points. Okay, so I see that we still have some minutes left, and I left the word to Stefan, I think.
Yeah, sure. So thank you, Luca. Moving into some other questions that are remaining, and apologies, we will not have time to get through all of them, but do with these couple remaining minutes want to answer some. So we have one here from a participant that says, let's say that we would like to apply this program to soybean production. The farmers did everything, and there's a positive greenhouse gas benefit, which will result in issuance of IUs. How will farmers be paid for this? Is it only the reporting company that can claim the greenhouse gas benefit? So yes, the intervention units would be issued to the intervention proponent. However, so essentially they would have that greenhouse gas benefit. However, of course, there are, in the case of an agricultural intervention, many participating landowners, farmers, and the benefit sharing will be set up before the intervention is deployed through contracts or agreements that detail the benefit sharing agreement. So really, that aspect of benefit sharing is up to the intervention proponent to design how those benefits will be shared amongst the project participants. All right. Anybody else want to jump in? Maybe have time for another one or two questions?
Yeah, so I can answer Martine's question. He was asking about would double VCS or Scope 3 certification verification be allowed? For example, I have an ongoing VCS project. Can I pursue a Scope 3 project? So I've answered a similar question in the chat, which, just to mention, we have answered 15 of your live Q&A questions in the chat. But yeah, just to clarify, we do allow joint registration between the VCS program and the Scope 3 standard program or any other Verra program, but we just would require you to be inactive in the other GHG program while you're operating in the Scope 3 standard program. Same with VCS, they have that same inactivity rule. So you kind of just have to like switch on and off between programs. So you can definitely verify and be issued units in the Scope 3 standard program. And then if you want to go back to VCS, you have to become inactive in the Scope 3, and then you can become active in this VCS program. So that's totally fine, but you can't operate simultaneously in both programs because that would pose double counting issues. Stefan, do you want to wrap up?
Yeah, I think I'll wrap us up. Thank you so much, Shay. Thanks, John, Luca, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. Yeah, we realized we didn't get to all of the questions, but many of them. But we encourage you to please review and submit your comments and feedback on our project program documentation. That's again open through April 21st. And you can follow up with additional questions through that process. So on behalf of the Scope 3 Standard Program team, on behalf of Verra, thank you so much, everyone. Wishing you a great day and looking forward to further engagement. Cheers. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.